The first is the one I've underlined just now, and that's actually the most fundamental. That is that there's a profound endogeneity here, that we're talking about the risk of very, very different and lower, much lower income standard of living levels than now. So reading off from current short-term 20 years or so growth paths and the interest rates associated with them is bound to be misleading. Secondly, there really aren't any markets for long-term collective decisions over 100 years where our preferences are revealed. Thirdly, if we ignore those first two mistakes and insist on looking at short-run private markets, we will find that over 40 or 50-year periods, the riskless rate of return is around 1 or 1.5%. It's the riskless rate of return that matters here, because we're going to take in this modeling, I'm not going to go into it, but we're going to make our treatment of uncertainty explicit through expected utilities and so on. So it's in this part of the story, it's the riskless rate of return that counts. So they actually come out quite low. But as I said, I don't like that source of evidence for the reason I've already remarked. Fourthly, where we have imperfect capital markets and where don't we have imperfect capital markets, there will be a difference between consumption rates of interest and social rates of return on investment. There'll be all kinds of concepts out there which are relevant in part to this story, but there'll be many in imperfect markets. There will be many kinds of interest rates which might be interesting. So we cannot just pick one without thinking about why many of those might be different. That's the fourth kind of mistake that many have made. They just rushed to one particular rate of return and said that's the only one of any interest. And fifth, and I think this is of particular importance, this is a multi-good framework. The discount rate in any model of cost-benefit analysis is the rate of fall of the value of the numeraire. It's the rate of fall of the value of the good in which you do your accounting. We've known in this profession since Malinvaud's wonderful 1953 piece on capital theory that if we look at different goods, we'll find different rates of change of value of those goods over time because the relative price of those goods is changing. That's the point. The relative price is changing, and the relative price of the standard goods that we face and the relative price of environmental goods will change. That's part of what this subject is about. So ignoring it is to assume away so much of what really matters. Well, that's 5 mistakes that have been made, and I say some people have made them all. And I think one of the reasons that this happened is the compartmentalization I've referred to and the neglect and suppression of basic public economics, which should have actually warned us about all 4 of the things that I've defined. So I've tried to illustrate the kinds of things I have in mind about the dangers of ignoring public economics that we did know in that particular area, which has obviously dominated my life for the last 4 or 5 years. But I should say, whilst I've focused on climate change, I would never see climate change in isolation from economic development. The 2 defining challenges of our century are overcoming world poverty and managing climate change, and we succeed or fail on those 2 challenges together. That's another lecture, but I couldn't leave this one without underlining that these challenges have to be treated together, and by focusing on climate change, I do not want to divert attention from the other. Now let me speak very briefly about theorems. And I'll just refer to 2 theorems. The first theorem, and these theorems, I'll speak these theorems, and I'll read the version of them in the paper, but they can be made mathematical, and I hope the proofs are pretty obvious, and I will explain why the proofs are pretty obvious. But since it's pretty obvious, you will see why without my explaining them. But they matter. In its theorem, this is the first of the theorems I want to point to, in an economy which is otherwise perfect, but which has an externality, a Pigovian tax can take us to a Pareto-efficient outcome. We all did that, I hope, some point in our undergraduate careers, although now there's no guarantee that you would have done. Second, but that's the first part, we know that. If an individual regards some of the loss to others as diminishing her own utility, then the appropriate tax will be lower. Suppose I have in my own utility function the full consequences of my colleagues and friends in society of my action, then I will not need a tax. I will not need a tax. Now that's a very important observation because it takes us directly to the role of discussion of responsibility in policy. John Stuart Mill famously wrote about government by discussion, where in the process of discussion you not only understand the evidence better, of course you do, you hope you do, through the process of discussion, but you also understand a notion of public responsibility better. We take a dim view now of drinking and driving. We've discussed it for a long time. We've looked at the evidence. We've discussed what responsible behaviour means. It's been a very public discussion and a very good discussion. But for those of you who are the same age or older than me, think back to the 1960s when that kind of legislation was discussed and introduced. Many people said it was an outrageous interference with personal freedom. What do you mean? A man can't go, now usually talking about a man can't go down to a pub and have a few pints after a heavy working day and drive himself home? He's only just got the income to buy the pints, he's only just got the income to buy the car, and you're suppressing his right to freedom of pleasure in this way? This is outrageous, they said. Now, if you tell that now to your children, they'd think it was extremely odd. How could anybody have thought that? How did we get where we are? We got there by public discussion and discussing what responsible behaviour means. So that very simple and rather obvious theorem opens up a whole range of policy discussion. And the policy discussion is actually in large measure part of policy. So that very simple observation, I think, takes us to thinking about policy in a different way. Now let me give you a second theorem. If the climate change externality falls on future generations, and of course it does, in the form of a deteriorated environment, then this generation can shift the balance of its legacy from standard goods, e.g. capital or infrastructure, and improve the welfare of future generations. Now, that's a very important observation. It's saying that the environment climate change externality leads, in a very standard way, to Pareto inefficiency. What does that mean? Well, in this case, it means we can make both generations, this generation and coming generations, better off. How do we do it? We do it by doing a bit less of the externality producing activity and a bit more of something else. So instead of leaving our future generations a deteriorated environment, we leave them a less deteriorated environment, but also less of other things, less infrastructure, less capital in some other way. That's a Pareto efficient improvement. So this story isn't just about this generation versus future generation. It's actually also about efficiency. And we can make this generation better off, next generation probably much better off, by shifting what we do and shifting our legacy to them. So again, a very simple and rather obvious theorem, but one I think that's largely been missed in much of the discussion on climate change. What we missed, as it were, is thinking through the consequences of the observation that this externality brings Pareto inefficiency. Now, this is my step to the last part that I want to say, because there's a very similar, indeed identical theorem in behavioral economics. And it's probably very well known, and Ernst will know whether it's very well known, but it's this one.